Taghut is often used as a religious bogeyman in Pakistan, yet at its core, it represents a simple but devastating political transgression, the creation of a state within a state. When individuals or groups bypass central legal authority to enforce their own rules, they aren't just engaging in dissent, they're dismantling the very social contract that holds a nation together. This brings us to a significant debate that resurfaced recently, one that tried to mask a very earthly political tactic under a veil of celestial dread.
The terminology is certainly heavy. Historically, Taghut stems from the Arabic root tagha, which means to cross a limit or to rebel. In a strictly theological sense, you find it 8 times in the Quran, usually referring to idols, Satan, or anyone who demands the worship and obedience that belongs solely to God. But in the modern Pakistani context, specifically looking at the discourse around 2024 and 2025, it's been weaponized. It's moved from the prayer mat to the political platform. When critics talk about Taghut today, they're often not talking about stone idols. They're talking about institutional rebellion.
It seems like a clever, if cynical, piece of marketing. If you call an opponent a bad politician, it's an opinion. If you label their actions as Taghut, you've suddenly invoked a cosmic struggle. But you mentioned this idea of state within a state. How does a religious term for idolatry suddenly become a synonym for a breakdown in administrative authority?
That's the bridge the campaigners, as some observers call them, tried to build. They argue that if the state's laws don't align perfectly with their specific interpretation of divine law, then those state laws are man-made impositions. By that logic, the state becomes a Taghut entity. This allows a group to justify setting up their own parallel courts, their own tax systems, and their own enforcement squads. They aren't just breaking the law, they're claiming the law itself has no legitimacy. We saw this quite starkly in the rhetoric used by various militant and hardline factions in the tribal areas and even in urban centers like Islamabad during periods of high tension.
So it's a way to delegitimize the Constitution of 1973. If you can convince the public that the existing legal framework is spiritually evil, you've essentially given them a moral license to ignore it. But isn't the Pakistani Constitution already explicitly Islamic? It begins with the objective resolution, stating sovereignty belongs to Allah. Doesn't that make the Taghut argument a bit redundant?
You've hit on the exact intellectual friction point. Scholars like Muhammad Zubair Abbasi have pointed out that Pakistan has a unique dual identity, a synthesis of Islamic and liberal constitutionalism. The constitution recognizes divine sovereignty, but mandates that this sovereignty be exercised through the people's elected representatives. The Taghut campaigners reject this middle way. To them, any lawmaking by a parliament is an act of shirk or associating partners with God because they believe only God can legislate. They use this religious fear to paralyze the average citizen. If you follow the traffic laws of a Taghuti state, are you committing a sin? That's the kind of psychological trap they set.
That sounds like a form of intellectual hypnotism. You use a terrifying word from a holy text to make people too afraid to function within a modern society. And while people are busy worrying about the state of their souls, these campaigners are building their own power bases. It's a classic power grab, hidden behind a shroud of piety.
Exactly. And we have to look at the blood-drinking claws of this monster, as some writers have described it. When you have a state within a state, prosperity vanishes. Why would anyone invest in a country where the rules change depending on which neighborhood you're in? We've seen reports, like those from the World Bank and various economic forums, showing that legal uncertainty is the single biggest killer of growth in developing nations. When the central authorities' writ is challenged by these parallel Taghut fighting entities, the first thing to die is the economy.
Let's look at the historical precedents for this. This isn't the first time the term has been used to shake a government's foundations. We can trace this back to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, can't we? Ayatollah Khomeini used the term Taghut to describe the Shah's regime.
Yes, Khomeini was a pivotal figure in moving Taghut from a theological concept to a revolutionary one. He used it to describe imperialistic and un-Islamic governance. In Pakistan, this was echoed later by figures like Abul Ala Maududi, though with different nuances. The danger is that once you label a government Taghut, you've essentially declared it fair game for any kind of rebellion. It removes the haram or forbidden status of revolting against a Muslim ruler. It's a total reset button on political stability.
But isn't there a flip side? If a government truly is tyrannical, doesn't the term provide a vocabulary for resistance? I want to play devil's advocate here. If a state is objectively oppressive, isn't it transgressing in the linguistic sense of tagha?
That is the nuanced trap. Classical scholars like Ibn Jarir al-Tabari defined Taghut as anything worshipped or followed in a way that exceeds the limits set by God. If a ruler demands that you commit murder or abandon your faith, they have crossed that line. However, the modern controversy in Pakistan isn't about the state forcing people into paganism. It's about the state's right to collect taxes, manage schools, and run courts. When campaigners call these basic functions Taghut, they aren't fighting tyranny, they're fighting the concept of a functional, unified nation-state.
It feels like a calculated attempt to keep the populace in a state of perpetual anxiety. If you can make a term sound scary enough, people won't look at the actual policy implications. They'll just react to the fear. And the goal, as we've seen, is often to establish a new expert class, those who claim they are the only ones who can protect you from this taghut.
And that expert class often operates with zero accountability. If you're working under divine authority, you don't need to answer to a parliament or a high court. This is the state within a state phenomenon that has plagued Pakistan's history, from the various Nizam-e-Adel experiments in Swat to the more recent political movements in urban centers. Every time a group successfully carves out a space where the national law doesn't apply, they call it a victory for the faith. But for the citizen on the street, it just means they've traded a known, albeit flawed, legal system for an arbitrary and often violent one.
What about the legal experts and the judiciary? How did they handle this surge of Taghut rhetoric? I recall the Supreme Court itself was under fire, especially during the tenures of Chief Justices like Qazi Fayaz Issa, who were often targeted by these same groups.
The judiciary has been in an incredibly tough position. In 2024, for example, we saw a massive social media campaign targeting the Supreme Court after rulings that protected the rights of religious minorities. The protesters didn't just say the court was wrong, they said the court was an instrument of Taghut. This is a very specific kind of threat. It's not just calling for a judge's resignation, it's calling for the abolition of the court's authority. When you look at the 2025 constitutional amendments, which significantly altered the power of the top court, part of the justification used by proponents, though often in hushed tones, was that the liberal court was out of step with the country's spiritual identity. It's the same Taghut logic, just dressed in a suit and tie.
So the term is a chameleon. It can be used by a militant in a cave or a politician in a parliament. In both cases, the target is the same, the central authority of the law. If the law can be labeled as illegitimate or rebellious against God, then anyone can justify their own version of justice. And that's where we get the vampiric claws that suck the life out of national progress.
Precisely. Think about the analogy of a ship. If every sailor on a ship decides that the captain's compass is evil and they should each use their own star to navigate, the ship isn't going to reach its destination. It's going to drift until it hits a reef. Pakistan's Taghut debate was exactly that, an attempt to convince the crew to ignore the compass of the Constitution. The result isn't a more spiritual voyage, it's a shipwreck. This is why the debate often fizzles out without result, as you mentioned. It doesn't lead to a better legal system, it just creates chaos. And when people get tired of the chaos, they go back to the status quo, but with a lot more trauma.
It's also fascinating how this word, which is supposed to be about unseen spiritual dangers, is used to address very seen things like the federal Shariat court or the tax code. It's a way of making the mundane seem mystical so that it can't be debated logically. You can't argue with someone who says your tax policy is Taghut because they've moved the goalposts to a field you can't see.
And that is why the definition offered by thinkers like Mustafa Sajjad Haider is so refreshing. He strips away the magic. He says, look, Taghut is just a bad way of doing politics. It's what happens when you decide you're above the law. Whether you're a corrupt official, a militant leader, or a political firebrand, if you're creating your own rules outside the agreed-upon social contract, you are the transgressor. You are the one crossing the limits, the literal definition of the root word.
It turns the tables on the campaigners. Instead of the state being the Taghut, the people trying to destroy the state's legal unity are the ones actually committing the act of Tagha, or transgression. They are the ones setting themselves up as a rival authority to the collective will of the people and the established legal order.
That's the ultimate irony. By claiming to fight Taghut, they become the very thing they claim to hate, an arbitrary, self-appointed authority that demands unquestioning obedience. And because their authority isn't grounded in a transparent, debate-based constitution, it becomes tyrannical by default. It's a closed loop of power that leaves the public with no recourse. If a state court makes a mistake, you can appeal. If a divine authority makes a mistake, you're a heretic if you question it.
This whole saga highlights a deeper struggle in Pakistan's identity, this tug of war between being a modern nation-state and a religious ideal. But, as we've discussed, these two things shouldn't be mutually exclusive. The Constitution was designed to be both. The use of Taghut as a wedge is a deliberate attempt to break that synthesis.
We have to remember that a nation's prosperity isn't just about gold and silver, it's about the predictability of its laws. According to the Pakistan Social Sciences Review, the use of religious rhetoric to justify political instability has historically preceded every major economic downturn in the country. When people stop trusting the law because it's been branded as unholy, they stop trusting the future. The Taghut campaign might have faded for now, but the underlying monster, the desire to bypass the law for personal or group power, is still very much alive.
It seems the only way to truly kill this monster is to demystify it, to realize that when someone starts using ancient, terrifying terms to describe modern administrative disagreements, they're probably just trying to win a political argument they can't win on the facts. The real danger isn't a word in a book, it's the person using that word to dismantle the rules we all live by.
Exactly. The Constitution isn't just a piece of paper, it's the firmest handle, to use a Quranic metaphor, that prevents a society from falling into the darkness of anarchy. Rejecting the Taghut of lawlessness and parallel authorities is actually the most Islamic thing a citizen can do if they want to preserve the peace and prosperity of their community.
It's a powerful perspective. By understanding Taghut not as a mystical curse, but as a practical political failure, we can start to see why these campaigns are so damaging. They don't offer a better way of life, they just offer a more frightening one. The path forward for any nation, especially one as complex as Pakistan, has to be through the light of clear, shared laws, not the shadows of manufactured fear.
The next time this debate resurfaces, and it likely will, the key will be to ask, what is the speaker actually trying to do? Are they trying to improve justice, or are they just trying to make themselves the new source of it? If we can keep our focus on the state within a state danger, the scary vocabulary loses its power.
That clarity is exactly what we need to move past these cycles of manufactured crises. Understanding the true meaning of the terms we throw around is the first step toward a more stable and prosperous society. If you found this breakdown of one of Pakistan's most controversial political terms helpful, please share this episode with a friend who appreciates a deeper look at the ideas shaping our world.